WNST, Towson, Baltimore. It's a great thing. It's called the WNST Tech Service. It's always sponsored by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. And of course, Dennis is here on Thursday driving you home. But I would say even Dennis is a little disappointed with the Tech Service right now, Luke, because every time you send the WNST text out, breaking news, it's bad news when it comes to the Ravens. Dude, this is not the time of the year I want to be getting texts from you in regard to the Ravens. And both of these on Thursday and Friday, and I was sort of monitoring Twitter and whatnot. I think for every Ravens fan, we got 10,000 people on our text service. When you get that sort of information on Thursday or Friday, you're like, you got to be kidding me. It's kind of like when Pete DeLutis and I found out that the Stones were canceling out in Vegas last year. It just sucks,
Yeah, and I mean, you and I, we had a chance to touch on Tavon Young late last week, and unfortunate, there's no doubt about that. We talked about the fact that that's kind of the one spot in their secondary where the depth isn't quite as good because their other corners are outside guys. He's that guy that was going to line up in the slot.
Well, he was their solution, right? I mean, he was the answer to that problem.
Sure.
Right?
I mean, he played at a very high level for a rookie a year ago. You were only expecting him to be better, and clearly they weren't looking for him to be a starter on the outside. That's why they signed Brandon Carr, and they drafted Marlon Humphrey for the future. But we've seen in this day and age in the NFL how important the nickel package in general has become. I mean, that's become as prevalent, if not more prevalent, than the base defense, given certain opponents that you'll face over the course of a season. So that was hard enough to deal with. But on the flip side with that, we saw that happen, or at least I saw that happen. Others in the media who were there, we weren't sure. We didn't find out until later on Thursday that it was a torn ACL, but you could tell it wasn't good. You could tell based on how the injury occurred, how he wasn't putting any weight on it, how John Harbaugh was not trying to diminish its severity after practice, kind of just said, we don't know yet. So you could kind of see that one happening. But Ness, seeing that the Ravens sent out, and the way they did this, there was no media coverage on Friday. So it came originally, the Ravens sent out a tweet with Ozzie Newsome's statement saying that Dennis Pitta had re-injured his hip. I kid you not, I was 30 seconds from getting into my car to head to the ballpark. So, I was kind of packing up, and I saw that, and my heart sank to my stomach. And look, we'll get into all the football ramifications with Dennis Pitta. We've talked about what's going to happen with Tavon Young being out now and who's going to play the nickel. But put football aside, put the Ravens aside. I couldn't have felt worse for Dennis Pitta and his family, considering everything he's been through. The fact that he worked for 2 full years, basically, of missed action.
To do something that everybody told me he couldn't do anyway, right?
I mean, I can still vividly recall us doing post-game after that Week 3 game in Cleveland in 2014, and we weren't saying it out of disrespect to Pitta, but we were just, we were resigned to the fact of just assuming that his career was over. Even, I think John Harbaugh was even asked about it that either that day or that week after, and, didn't say that his career was over, but he kind of said, yeah, I mean, you kind of wonder if Dennis will be able to come back. Will he want to be able to come back? All of that. I mean, you couldn't find anyone at that point in time in September of 2014 who thought that Dennis Pitta was going to play again, other than maybe Dennis Pitta, and even he acknowledged over the better part of the last couple of years that there were lots of times that he didn't know if it was going to happen. He didn't know if he was going to decide to continue to pursue it. Remember, he practiced in 2015 for that 3-week period when he was on the PUP list and decided he wasn't cleared to return. There were so many times where we just assumed, and not that it was a punchline because I think that's disrespectful, but no one thought that he was going to play, really. And I don't think the Ravens really thought he was going to play. And for him to come back last year, and look, we talked about it. Was he as explosive as he'd been in the past? No. Did Joe target him a little bit too much at times to the detriment of the rest of the offense? You could say that, sure. I mean, there are plenty of those issues you could talk about. But the fact that this guy got back on the field, was healthy, contributing, led the NFL in receptions by a tight end, caught his first 2 touchdowns in a 2-year period, or a 3-year period, actually. And for this to happen in an OTA, in another non-contact situation, I mean, it's heartbreaking. And to think that Dennis Pitta and his family, and I know his wife and his mother, they weren't crazy about him coming back. They supported him, obviously, but they were fearful of this happening again. And for them to go through this, forget about what it means for the Ravens. Forget about football. We assume this will be it because Dennis almost didn't come back after the second one. And I would think at this point, you got to think about your family, man. You got to think about your kids and being able to play with them and being able to walk and play golf when you're older and all of that. And he's already acknowledged, even before this injury, that, yeah, he'll probably have to get a hip replacement after his football career is over. I mean, he knew that, and doctors had told him that. So for this to take this kind of a turn, I mean, it's absolutely heartbreaking, and you wouldn't wish this on any player, whether it's a good guy or a guy who's not so well, not as well liked. But for it to happen to a guy who, Dennis Pitta is good people, and to see that happen to him, I mean, it was heartbreaking, and one of those that whether you're a fan, media member, opposing players, anyone who has had any interaction or has at all been invested in Dennis Pitta, it's absolutely horrible to see this happen again.
He is Luke Jones. You can find him, Luke, at WNST.net, as well as Baltimore Luke out on Twitter. And, I could give my own soliloquy. And, my affection for Dennis Pitta is very well worn. His affection for us and for what we do here and for my wife and her illness and, all the stuff that, they were both going through at the same time, quite frankly. Of all the Raven players, and I'll throw Ray Lewis in this because Harbaugh once had a press conference saying Ray's career was done, and he wound up coming back and playing football, right? In the case of Pitta, him coming back, of all the things I've seen in the 21 years on the football field, and, I would put the David Quessenberrys and, coming back from lymphoma, and he's trying to do that now, and after seeing what my wife has gone through with cancer, and we've had, there have been a lot of tragedies and different stuff, but from a football standpoint, Dennis Pitta's road to get back to catch 86 balls last year and lead the team, lead all tight ends in the NFL in receptions last year. That was maybe the most unlikely thing you could have thought of 2 years ago, that he could have done that. And just, we had a press conference last week. Luke, you were there asking questions, and Dennis is having fun with Brandon Williams and his contract and all that kind of stuff, and taking a pay cut because he knew he had to. He knew he would wherever he played and wanted to be here. That it really did start to feel like, well, maybe he won't ever get hurt again. Maybe we're just all fooling ourselves to believe that with that kind of a joint and that sort of place where football players are going to get hit, or in this case, probably not hit, that it would not reoccur. May have been a little foolish on our part, but there is a point where you get further and further removed where it's more out of sight, out of mind, right? And I don't think any of us thought that he wouldn't be playing in Week 8 this year, right?
Yeah, well, how about, and this was one of my favorite little factoids of last season, despite it not being as successful as the Ravens had hoped it would be. Dennis Pitta was their only tight end who played in all 16 games last year. I mean, we've talked about the Ravens' inventory at that position for the last few years, going back to drafting, Crockett Gilmore and Max Williams and Nick Boyle and adding Ben Watson and converting Darren Waller. Dennis Pitta was the only one of that group to play in all 16 games a year ago. And you're right. As much as, for me, it started last spring in OTAs and him going through training camp. Remember, he missed most of training camp, actually, because he had the broken finger from his little dust-up with Kamale Correa at the stadium practice. So we didn't even really get a chance to see him live contact over the summer. So there was such an unknown there. And I remember sitting in press boxes with you on a weekly basis. Anytime you'd see Pitta make a catch and get hit, you kind of hold your breath a little bit. And, that subsided a bit as the season went on. And then he got through the year. And you're right. It kind of got to a point where, and, Dennis even made the joke that I remember him being out with us at Greenmount Station late last season talking about, it's nice getting to a point where I don't have to talk about my hip quite as much. And he made that point even last week in Owings Mills. And for him to go through this after what was such a terrific comeback. And one of the points that really stuck with me, and I can't remember exactly when he said it because, God knows he's had so many different press conferences where the topic of conversation has been his hip and solely his hip, or when are you going to retire? I mean, that's been the gist of so many press conferences over, the better part of the last, 3 years, I guess. And I can remember at one point, he flat out acknowledged, look, the Ravens made a huge financial commitment to me, and we're going back to the off season of 2014 after the first hip injury when he had gotten back. Remember, he had made a tremendous comeback to return and play late that season, which, in retrospect, was that what was best for him? Who knows? But I remember him saying that, he felt like he had let the organization down, which is, a silly. It's admirable for him to say, but it's a silly notion. I mean, he didn't want to get hurt. I mean, it was a freak way that it happened the very first time, but no one would have blamed him for walking away after that second one. And keep in mind, he had received a boatload of guaranteed money at that point that he was entitled to. That was injury guaranteed money and everything. So he could have walked away at that point, but wanted to come back. We know he didn't do it for free. He was still being paid these last couple of years, and he did take a pay cut because he knew he would have been cut, and who knows if anyone else would have even signed him. Keep in mind, he had signed an injury waiver to play the last year and was going to this year as well. So, all that factored in. I mean, this is a guy who loves this organization, has been a good soldier, was absolutely enormous for this team in 2012. One of my favorite Dennis Pitta plays wasn't a touchdown at all. It was his huge conversion when the Ravens were backed up in that Denver playoff game, 3rd and long, and he caught that pass from Flacco, leaped up in the air, and what was it, 3rd and 20 or something? I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but they were backed up. They were in the shadow of their own end zone at that point. And that was a play that gave them some breathing room, got them to get their field position back in order. I mean, that was an absolutely enormous play, and that was Dennis Pitta. He wasn't necessarily a highlight reel kind of guy, but reliable. That's how he was early in his career, and was exceptional lining up in the slot before the first hip injury. We never really saw him quite get back to that point, of course, but this is a guy who, and I'll give him the dignity of saying officially when it's it. I'm guessing this is it for him. I'd be, as shocked as I was the last time, I'd be tenfold more shocked this time.
Yeah, we don't even know what the injury is. We just know it was bad enough for the Ravens to...
Right.
Yeah.
It's a dislocated hip again, but, excuse me, it's tough to see.
He is Luke Jones. You can find him, Luke, at WNST.net, as well as Baltimore Luke out on Twitter. And, of course, the Ravens reeling from all of this. But then Twitter sort of lights up at one point where we're like, who are they going to sign? Are there going to be any players? No running backs, no tight ends, no wide receivers. And then, lo and behold, the Kansas City Chiefs on a Friday afternoon do a little news dump and cut their wide receiver. This is the latest. This is the first. I mean, there's going to be more players, I think, coming down the line that wind up available out in the marketplace, and the Ravens will be competing with other teams for that. But the Jeremy Maclin rumors will begin right now, Luke, right?
Yeah, and excuse me, I'm losing my voice a little bit, but...
You're loud. You talk a lot.
It's been a long weekend at the ballpark, but, with Maclin, he makes sense. He's a guy who can line up in the slot, possession guy. We've talked about this at length with Mike Wallace and Perriman. They have vertical threats. Macklin's not really that kind of guy. He's a guy that's going to move the chains, can give you some size, but they need that. And especially now, without Pitta, they don't have anyone that can move the chains. Who do you look at right now? Maybe Danny Woodhead can be that guy for them. Maybe, but 32, coming off of an ACL injury. They need someone that they can count on third down. And, Jeremy Maclin could be that guy, but as you pointed out, the problem is really going to be other teams are going to be going after him as well. Ravens have some cap room, not a whole lot. They would probably need to make some maneuvers, whether it's a restructure, whether it's cutting some players. So it's really going to be, it's going to be interesting to see. But as far as right player, I think it's a no-brainer. I'm not saying that Jeremy Maclin is the savior, because he's a guy who's had some injuries. Production has slipped a bit here.
But they could be significantly better,
Absolutely.
If he's on the roster, we feel better about their football team. And I don't disagree with that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you can make it work from a financial standpoint, and that's going to be the big if, and he's going to be in high demand. There's absolutely going to be some teams that are vying for his services, because this was a surprise. I mean, there had been some talk about the possibility of him being cut, but even in OTAs, he was running with the first-team offense and looked like things were fine there. And he, I think, he got married or something like that, and I think Andy Reid was at his wedding a couple weeks ago. I mean, this was one of those examples that shows how cold the business can be. But there are going to be some teams that are after Jeremy Maclin, but I'm all for it. I mean, the Ravens have to do something. I mean, we've talked about this even before the Pitta injury, and now losing him. And not to say that Dennis Pitta was an all-pro, but you knew what you were going to get from him. We know what he did for this team last year. And not having him, not having Steve Smith, who's Joe Flacco looking to on third down right now? And I have no idea.
But it's only June.
Whether it's Maclin, whether it's Anquan Bolden, we've talked about that at length. I can't fathom that Ozzie Newsome and John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta and the Brain Trust can sit there and think that this offense, the way it's constructed right now, is going to be good enough to get them to the playoffs. And I don't care how good the defense is. You can't have an incompetent offense. And, incompetence too strong maybe, but you can talk all you want about a running game. Well, offensive line, we haven't talked about that. But now specifically with the passing game, already knowing that, wide receivers, a question mark as far as who's going to be that intermediate guy. And now that you've lost Dennis Pitta, who, at the very least was someone Joe Flacco could look to on third and short, third and medium, you got to bring someone else in. I think it's a hope and a prayer if you're going to look at this offense, this roster, the way it's constructed right now, and think that you're going to have enough to get to where you're going. So, whether that's Maclin, whether that's making a trade, I still, I'll go a step further and say I'm more concerned about the offensive line even than this group of pass catchers, and that's saying a whole lot. They can't possibly sit here and look at their roster construction right now with the Pitta injury on top of everything else we've talked about at length for the last few months and think that that's going to be good enough. I like the defense. I don't like it as much without Tavon Young now, but I'm very clearly, I'm on board with the defense being really good, but is the defense going to be so special that they can overcome an offense that's going to, that looks like it's going to be below average on paper?
Well, they're a worse team on Monday than they were on Thursday. We'll all agree with that, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it's just, it's deflating. It's disappointing. I mean, you have Tavon Young, a guy in his second year, and Dennis Pitta, who, besides what he offered as a player, I mean, this is a guy well respected in the locker room. I mean, this is one that hurts. I mean, this is one that it's devastating. The silver lining is that these injuries have occurred in early June as opposed to August or September or October, where you're kind of stuck. But at the same time, great football players aren't necessarily just sitting out there. And I don't know if Jeremy Maclin, I don't know if I'd call him a great wide receiver, but he's a good wide receiver, and I think that would be a piece that could really help them. But I'm still looking at that offensive line and plenty of angst involving that group too. But what's clear is I don't see any way how the Ravens can stand pat on offense and expect that that's going to be a good enough group in 2017.
Who's going to get their mojo back first, your voice or LeBron James? What do you think?
Hopefully my voice. It's kind of in and out here, but it's funny. And I didn't get a chance to see any of Game 1. I saw chunks of Game 2. So much talk about the rematch here, and last year was an incredible story. Cleveland, coming back from down 3-1, but. And if I'm rooting for a team, I might even be rooting for the Cavs a little bit. don't really care all that much rooting-wise, but I don't know. I just got a sense with Golden State, with Kevin Durant, who heard all, over the last calendar year that you took the easy way out, and everything they've dealt with Steve Kerr, who's been in so much pain with the back and just returned to the sideline Sunday night. But you just look at that team after last year, they set the all-time win-loss record, win record, and they don't finish the job. This just feels like a team that's on a mission, and I said it just talking to a couple of my buddies about the series that are big into the NBA. As someone who doesn't watch a ton, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on it, but I said I wouldn't be shocked if Cleveland gives them a series, but at the same time, I don't know. I just have a sense that I feel like Golden State might just steamroll them, and we'll see what happens when they go back to Cleveland. But it's looking like the latter is possible, and I'm not so sure Cleveland's going to have the same kind of mojo working as they did last year, unless Draymond Green decides he's going to hit someone in the groin again.
Well, yeah, I mean, we'll keep an eye out for that in Cleveland. But, hey, I think they'll be lucky to win a game, Cleveland, at this point. I mean, it feels pretty lopsided. I thought it was lopsided coming in. I think Golden State's made everything lopsided in this postseason. I mean, this is – you talk about things that are impressive, whether it was the Patriots going 18-0 and finally succumbing in the end, or the Dolphins' perfect season, or Golden State's. I mean, to roll through the playoffs undefeated, that's kind of an incredible thing they're in the process of doing right now.
Well, how about the fact that they rolled through the West and Cleveland rolled through the East the way that they did, and now through the first two games, and look, it could be a different series when it goes back to Cleveland. I mean last year's series finals started out like this. But the fact that Golden State has completely steamrolled Cleveland now, it's impressive. I mean, if they can finish the job here, and look, they'll always be dogged by what happened last year when you try to compare them to the 95-96 Bulls who won 72 games, and they bested them regular season wise, but they didn't finish the job. But they finished this off. If they sweep the Cavs, you got to put this team right up there with any single season team in the history of the NBA. It's just absolutely impressive to watch.
He is Luke Jones. You can find him out on Baltimore Luke on Twitter, as well as Luke at WNST.net. His voice is much stronger on the internet, I assure you of that. He'll be covering the Orioles this week against the Buccos, and, of course, the Birds headed to Washington before going to Yankee Stadium this weekend and on to Chicago next week. We're going to be monitoring the Ravens. They're up on minicamp next week, as well as the Stanley Cup Finals and the NBA Finals this week. We're just hoping that Pittsburgh doesn't win, and I'm not really worried about Cleveland winning right now, so that's good. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. I'm out on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, and streaming live on our Facebook Live, as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. And, of course, our morning newspaper ships to your email inbox each and every morning at 7 a.m. That's all brought to you by our friends at Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life. The breaking news does happen first. Even when it's bad news, you get it first on the WNST Tech Service. It's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.